Well, until he gets that working, that's fine. I'll just go ahead and start.
My name is Dwayne. I work at the Monash Indigenous Center at Monash University. Although I still reside in Sydney, I'm about to move down, so I'm quite happy about coming here to Melbourne to see a city that I hear so many great things about. I'm going to talk about something a bit different today from the rest of the talks that have been going on all week, about Indigenous sky knowledge, and more specifically, the science of Indigenous sky knowledge. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that anywhere in this country where we stand, we are on Aboriginal land. And this is the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, both past and present, and extend that respect on to anybody who happens to be here of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. So much of what non-Indigenous Australia thinks it knows about Aboriginal culture and people is constantly changing. And what we're finding out is something that Aboriginal people have been saying for a very long time. You don't have it right. A lot of the things that we think we know about it are wrong. The old colonial mentality that Aboriginal people were somehow a Stone Age people, nomadic hunter-gatherers who just eked out a living for 60 or 70,000 years is complete rubbish. We are finding now, like I said, this is something Aboriginal people have been saying for a very long time, have very complex knowledge systems. We find that Aboriginal people practiced agriculture and aquaculture, that they practiced extremely effective land resource management. There are stone villages. This idea of the nomadic Aborigine should really be dead in the water, but unfortunately it hasn't quite got there yet in a lot of academic circles. I think we're really coming around to understanding that Indigenous cultures are far more complex than we could have ever thought, or that we still think about today. I think most of you are probably aware that there are a lot of different Aboriginal communities. There are several hundred across the country, each with a distinct language and culture. And what I'd like to talk about today is the idea, or the fact, I should say, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have complex knowledge systems that include a scientific element. And the scientific element informs navigation, it informs food economics, calendars, and it also informs ceremony, kinship, and other social structure elements. Now, I imagine a few of you are thinking, where's that voice from? Yes, I am American. I've been in Australia for about 10 years now. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge I am not Indigenous. I'm not even Australian. 10 years, I'm still not even a PR yet. Hopefully we'll fix that this year. This is not my knowledge. This is something that I've learned about by sitting with elders in the Torres Strait, here on the mainland, all over the place. Yes, I've spent time in libraries, but most of what I've learned has been from the Aboriginal people themselves. So I simply consider myself a conduit of this information. But given my background in astrophysics, I do kind of approach this from a different perspective. With my training in astronomy, when I go through and read the old oral traditions that were recorded up to 150, 200 years ago, when I listen to the elders talk, I can immediately recognize the scientific information encoded in there. They're not just stories. They're not just myths and legends. It's complex scientific information. So what I want to talk to you about today are a few of the examples of this that are scattered throughout the different elements of Aboriginal astronomy. So I keep saying Aboriginal astronomy or Indigenous astronomy. What am I talking about? I sort of interchangeably use star knowledge or sky knowledge or astronomy. Astronomy is a science. It's the science of everything outside of our atmosphere. It can be considered a science of the formation, evolution, and structure of the universe. And as a science, it explains things. It explains the world around us. It makes predictions. It's based on experimentation and observation. So when I talk about this, Aboriginal astronomy, that's exactly what I mean. Aboriginal traditions that talk about scientific information. Now, how would we distinguish knowledge from tradition? Knowledge is the information you have that connects how the stars can inform you about practices on the earth, and I'll give you lots of examples of that today. Traditions are how you transmit that knowledge to successive generations. Song. story, dance, artifacts, rock art, bark paintings, all those kinds of information are how you pass that knowledge on. So, what is the difference between astrophysics and Aboriginal astronomy or indigenous astronomy? Well, astrophysics we think of as a physical science. When we talk about indigenous astronomy, we're actually talking about cultural astronomy. How is this information developed and understood and utilized in a cultural context? And this cultural context is usually tied to a specific place or an environment. Now, the knowledge Aboriginal people have of the cosmos you can think of as a physical science. But me as an academic, when I come in, we're looking at this as a social science. So I'm kind of coming in and trying to bridge these two very different worlds of the social sciences and the physical sciences. And there are a lot of challenges involved in that, but I want to kind of get right to the thick of what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the pervasive myths that have plagued some of the studies in indigenous astronomy was the idea that Aboriginal people did not navigate by the stars. That has been repeated throughout the literature for probably about 80 years or so. And the fact of the matter is, Aboriginal people did navigate by the stars. Torres Strait Islander people, being a seafaring culture, obviously navigate by the stars. In fact, the navigational star is that big star in the middle of the Torres Strait Islander flag. But what I want to talk to you about today is some of the other ways in which Aboriginal people navigated by the stars. Not in the sense that we think of finding a star and following that star because we know that it sets at a particular azimuth. I don't want to throw in too much jargon in here, but where's north in here? I have no idea where I am. Let's assume, everybody's pointing in different directions, thanks. Let's just assume for sake of argument this is north. So we can do a big circle, 360 degrees. So north is 0 degrees, due east is, right, 90 degrees, south, 180, west, 270, right. So any latitude, location on the earth, you can look and a star will always set at the same azimuth. But we're not talking about that. That's sort of, we think about that in Polynesia, certainly. What about in Australia? Well, what we find, and working with some of the elders, is that we have star maps. And these star maps don't work in the way where you follow a star, but rather that a group of stars traces out the shape of a map, where each one of the stars is a waypoint, just like in your GPS. And the way the waypoints work is they could be a water hole, they could be a mountain, confluence of a river, any of those types of things. So here's a couple of examples, I probably can't see it too well with the light, of some star maps. You can see the Milky Way there. And you see in Sagittarius and Scorpius some of the different stars, and they trace out this path that the people know how to travel to for ceremony. So this might start, this for example comes from the Yuwalyi people in northern New South Wales. So by knowing where these points are and knowing how to get from point A to point B, they can travel several hundred kilometers to distant places for ceremony and trade. Here's another one that has a different final location that's also used for ceremony and trade. Well, these are part of what we call song lines. So if you need to memorize your way across a landscape, you can sing a song. And this is done in Australia. There are song lines that crisscross the entire country, from the east coast to the west coast, north to the south. There are song lines that go from the Kimberley to Central Australia to the coast. Because ceremony and trade occurred between Aboriginal people all across the country. And that, incidentally, is another one of those pervasive myths, that Aboriginal different language groups just sort of stuck to themselves and didn't do much travel. No, there were traveling networks all across the country. So in these song lines, you'd memorize the song, you'd memorize the positions of the stars at night. Now these stars, the time that they're visible at night is not the time of the year that the people would travel. They would travel during the day, later in the year when these stars weren't even visible. But at night, during the winter, during the summertime, they would memorize these positions. Now, what's quite interesting about this, and what a lot of people didn't realize, is when you look at these traveling routes, these songline routes, they actually coincide very well with our modern road system. And that makes perfect sense. If you're going to travel from point A to point B, you've got a way across the landscape. Usually tends to be an easy way to remember it. Usually tends to be, wouldn't say the path of least resistance, but the best way to navigate through country. So these song lines, when the first colonists came to these areas, they followed those same dreaming tracks. They got beaten down, horses, and then later on paved, became our highway system. That doesn't fit exactly perfect, but you can still see a lot of these waypoints coincide to some towns and other major geographical areas. So in a very real sense, Aboriginal star maps helped lay out the framework of some of our modern highway systems. But of course, you do still have other forms of navigation where you do actually follow the stars. So this here is Bill Edom Damaharney. He's a senior Wardaman elder. The Wardaman people are in the Northern Territory, about 3 hours west of Catherine. And Uncle Edom Dama talks about how the drovers and his people, long before the drovers were around, would pay attention to the stars to navigate across country. And he would actually use the constellation of Scorpius not only as a navigational tool, but as a clock. Because as the Milky Way rotates around the south celestial pole at night as the sky turns, the position of the Scorpion turns like this. And it very much looks like the hands of a clock. So you'd be able to look at the position of Scorpius and tell what time of the night it was. Now, of course, in the Torres Strait, being a seafaring culture, navigation was quite prominent. But there's some interesting new information coming out from some research. A colleague of mine named Victor Briggs at the University of New England in Adelaide is doing research for his PhD about Aboriginal navigation across Oceania. Not something most people talk about or hear about. There are traditions from Fiji and Polynesia that talk about connections with Aboriginal people traveling out by watercraft to those islands and back. So he's exploring that in some more detail. And it might explain why you have remote tribes in the Amazon that have Aboriginal DNA that you don't find anywhere else in North America. Don't know if that's the case, but it might be the reason why. Some exciting new research coming out in that area. So we can definitely see that Aboriginal people not only, in certain cases, would navigate by following stars, but would also create star maps based on the positions of stars in the sky. Constellations and calendars. When I talk about a constellation, most of us think of bright stars that you connect the dots that make a familiar shape. What are some constellations you guys know of? Just shout it out. Orion. Right, so most people know about 12, right? Usually about 12. Those are the constellations of the zodiac. Those are the constellations that the sun passes through in the sky. Anybody here the star sign Ophiuchus? One person is. Really? Yes. Excellent, excellent. Nobody else? No? No? You want to explain what Ophiuchus is?
13th constellation in the zodiac.
That's it, 13th constellation zodiac. A little sliver of it the sun actually passes through. What is your birthday?
I'm in Ophiuchus.
I'm trying to remember. I don't study astrology. I just know that bit.
6th of December.
6th of December. Excellent. Anybody else here early December? Well, see, there you go. You might be Ophiuchus too. Point being, when we talk about constellations, we think of bright stars, make a familiar shape. You do have examples of that in Australia, and I'll talk about a couple later on, but in most cases in Aboriginal Australia, connected dots constellations are actually fairly rare. Instead of a pattern in the sky, you tend to have individual stars or a small group of stars that represent a particular character in an oral tradition. There's a very famous one I'm going to talk about right now. Actually, I'm going to show you a video of it, if it'll work.
like to talk about some traditional knowledge that was handed down to most of us Indigenous fellows in this area, and it's the emu in the sky. Around April, May every year, the emu will appear in the Milky Way. Just underneath the Southern Cross, you'll see a dark spot, a rounded dark spot. That's the head of the emu. In front of him, of course, is his beak, and as we follow it down, you can see his neck in the dark spots of the Milky Way, coming right down to his body. You can see his legs, and you can see a couple of legs underneath. At that certain time of year, it's the time for us to go out and collect emu eggs. We go out, of course, into the bush, always leaving some eggs for next year and for generations to keep going. They only last up until early June. Anytime after early June they start getting chicks in them, but before that, from April, May, you're pretty right to go gather.
So what you see here is a constellation not traced out by the bright stars, but traced out by the dust lanes in the Milky Way. And you see lots of examples of these dark sky constellations in Australia and around the southern hemisphere. So in Australia, besides the emu, you'll see stingrays, you'll see crocodiles, you'll see a cave in which an evil spirit will dwell. So this case here is one of the very common examples of a dark sky constellation you find all across Australia. Wherever you have emus, almost always you find the emu in the sky constellation. So this is used as a calendar marker. So when the emu begins to rise in the evening at dusk, it tells the people the emus are laying their eggs, and you want to collect the emu eggs as a food source. That's really the kindergarten version of the story. Now I want to test you guys to see how well you're paying attention. What was the sex of the emu? Did he say his or her? Said he, right? Sitting on the eggs. Why? Any ornithologists in here?
The breeds in South America, the male
It's the same here, yes. The male emus sit and incubate the eggs and actually help rear the young. Now, there are multiple parts to this story, so the idea that serves as a calendar is the preschool version of it. This is Gil R. Michael Anderson. He is a senior Uwalyi lawman and one of the founders of the Tent Embassy. He's also a very famous lawyer from ANU. He explains some of the knowledge about the emu in the sky from his people, the Uwalyi people. And where the emu in the sky is in the evening can mean different things. So in the early evening, when the emu is just starting to rise, it is a female emu that is running. She's running because she's chasing a mate. So with the emus, the females chase the males. A little bit later on in the year, after dusk, the emu is a bit higher in the sky. In that case, that's the male emu sitting on the nest, incubating the eggs. I think if you know much about emus, I didn't before I started doing this, the emu males will sit on the eggs and they won't get up or move for almost 2 months. And sometimes if you see an emu nest, you'll see sort of food or fruit growing around it, and they will deliberately have their nest there so the males can reach out and sort of eat that fruit, because they don't get up for was it 54 days, I think, something like that. A little bit later on, when the emu is straight up and down in the sky, relates to ceremony. I'll talk about that in just a minute. A little bit later on in the evening, as you start to get into what we think of as spring, this signifies the time that the emus are leaving the water holes, they begin drying up, and the hot weather is approaching. So where the emu in the sky is throughout the year means different things. Across Southeast Australia in particular, across all of Australia, you have initiation ceremonies where the youth are taught the laws, traditions, and customs and go through a ceremony which can last days, weeks, even months, through which time they come into adulthood. Now, a lot of the information about these ceremonies are, of course, secret and sacred, and I'm not going to be talking about any of that. But the public information is that in southeastern Australia in particular, a lot of these grounds, which are called, the common name is Bora grounds. Bora comes from the Gamilaroi word, which is what we were just looking at before with the emu, consist usually of two circles. One larger circle, and this is either raised earth or stone, and a small circle some distance away connected by a pathway. The large circle was the public area, and the small circle was where the secret business happened. Now, we'll talk any more about that, but we do find that there is a very specific orientation to a lot of these Bora sites. These Bora sites are oriented to the position of the Milky Way in the sky. Not just the Milky Way, but a reflection of the Earth Bora and the Sky Bora when they connect directly to each other, when the Milky Way comes straight down and connects to the land. Everything that happens on the land is reflected in the sky. It's one of the common sayings with a lot of Aboriginal communities. Now, that same Bora in the sky is directly tied with the emu in the sky, just like we see here. And one of the reasons for this is symbolic. As the male emus take care of the young and rear the young, it's symbolic of the men in the community bringing the boys into manhood. So it has both a scientific purpose in telling you about the behavior of the animal, a food source, and changing seasons. It also has a ceremonial and cultural purpose. I think, as you mentioned before, the rhea in South America, a bird very similar to an emu, have nearly identical traditions. So this is from Bolivia, Peru, Brazil. The Inca actually saw the same shape in the sky as a llama. The two pointer stars were the eyes of the llama, so it's a little bit different because it's not the head, but with the rhea, it's the exact same view. And in South America, you have also lots of dark sky constellations. You don't really see too many of these in the Northern Hemisphere, and I think the reason for that is, I don't know if you guys are aware of how beautiful your skies are down here, how much you can actually see when you're not in one of the cities. But you can see the Magellanic Clouds, the whole middle of the Milky Way, the galactic bulge, huge amount of stuff you can see down here. You don't really see much of that from the Northern Hemisphere. So that's an example of a dark sky constellation. I want to give you an example of one of the examples of a connect the dots constellation amongst Aboriginal cultures. This is Julpan from the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land. There are lots of different stories of Julpan. I'm going to tell you one that I'm aware of, and most of them are roughly the same. In this story, there are three brothers of the kingfish totem. So when you're part of a totem, it's your responsibility to look after that animal. For these boys, it's the kingfish. That means it cannot harm or kill a kingfish. They are going on a fishing expedition, but the elders on the beach were saying, you probably shouldn't be going out to do this right now. This is the time of the year when storms can come pretty quickly. And the boys sort of looked, they saw clear blue skies, they said, we'll be fine. And they went out to sea to fish. Well, they'd been out at sea for quite some time and were having no luck catching anything but the kingfish, which they had to release unharmed. Well, as the day grew on, the brothers grew tired and frustrated, and they decided amongst themselves that they were going to bring in a catch of kingfish, and as soon as they got to the beach, they were going to clean them, scale them, so that therefore when they got back to the community, nobody would know they broke the sacred law. Well, while they're sort of squabbling with each other, trying to figure out how they're going to do this, storms begin coming. The storm clouds begin bellowing in the background. So the brothers see the clouds and they start heading back to shore. Well, the sun woman, in most Aboriginal cultures, not all, but most, the sun is female and the moon is male. The sun woman saw what the boys had done and became very angry with them. And she created a whirlwind which took the boys in their canoe up into the sky where we can see them today. This constellation of Julpan we see as the western constellation of Orion. The three brothers are the three stars in the belt of Orion. Betelgeuse and Rigel are the bow and stern of the canoe. And the scabbard of Orion's sword, where you see the Orion Nebula, that's where the kingfish are trailing behind the canoe. So there are three elements of this story that were important. Number one, the importance of obeying sacred law. Number two, listen to your elders, they have wisdom. Why is that important? Well, when this constellation rises in the evening, that's when the monsoon season comes. You can go from clear skies to terrible skies in a very short amount of time. So you've got lots of different lessons there, but there is a scientific element encoded within that. So going on, this is something coming out of some of the latest research we're doing. When I talk about properties of stars, you look up at the sky, you see stars, what do you notice about them? Anybody? What are some of the properties of stars? They're different colors, that's one. Excellent. So the colors we tend to see are red, orange, blue, and white. Those tend to be the colors, maybe some combination of those. The colors are very important because they have relationships to the animals or plants or whatever it happens to be on the earth that is related to them. So for example, this is a red-tailed black cockatoo. What kind of star do you think this relates to? What color star? Red, of course, right. In the Uldian traditions, the Great Victoria Desert, this star is related to Antares and Mars. When Antares rises, as it turns out, this is when the birds are laying their eggs. When Antares sets, this is when the eggs are hatching. So it can mean different things related to the animal, but oftentimes the red is very, very important. So sticking on that theme there, some of the information we talked about before with the emu in the sky, it talks about the behavior of the animals. And a lot of the traditions talk about different animal behavior or the availability of different plants. So it's one of the many ways that you can look at the sky and you have a mnemonic, you have a way of memorizing that information. So if you've got a bird with bright red feathers that relates to a red star, that red star rises maybe at dusk, maybe at dawn, depending on the behavior of that animal. That's all information you have to work out. That's all scientific information that was developed through observation, experimentation, and is used for predictive purpose. That star is rising, that bird's going to be laying its eggs soon. That is science at its fundamental level. What are some other properties of stars? They twinkle. They change brightness. Some of them, I'll talk about twinkling stars in just a second, but the changing of the brightness of stars is very significant. Anybody in here an astronomer? Anybody study astrophysics? Couple? Excellent. So we know because of the internal structure of stars, some of them pulsate, some of them explode. You have all kinds of different, what we call variable stars. Variable just means the brightness of the star varies. There's three different examples here. I would like to talk briefly about each one. This star here, I've already mentioned a couple times, is Betelgeuse. It's a red supergiant star, and it varies in brightness by about 1 full magnitude over the course of about a year. Now William Herschel is one of the astronomers, or the astronomer who's often cited as being the person who discovered the variability of Betelgeuse. But if you pay close attention to the stars, you can actually notice it's not a subtle change in brightness. It's a significant change in brightness over the course of a year. And what we found were some traditions from the Uldia region, the same as I mentioned before with the bird, where there's a story, a relationship between the stars in Orion and the stars of the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters star cluster in the constellation Taurus. And it talks about how there was this sort of tension and battle between the two. The man was a hunter pursuing the Seven Sisters of the Pleiades. Their elder sister stood between them. She was the cluster of stars, the Hyades. And she would prevent the man from getting to the girls. And she would humiliate him, and he would get very angry, and his anger and his passion would cause his arm, which was Orion, to flare up. And over time, he would be humiliated, and his arm would flare down. So he described this pulsating brightness change of Antares, which is exactly what you can see if you pay close attention to that star. So that's quite interesting. It seems to be describing the variability of the star Betelgeuse in oral traditions. You're not going to notice that unless you're paying close attention. On the top left there, that is an image of an event that happened in the 1840s. It's called the Great Eruption of Eta Carina. Eta Carina is a hypergiant variable star. blue luminous star, actually. And back in the 1840s, this went from a fairly inconspicuous, moderate brightness star, yeah, you could see it, but it wasn't anything important, to being the second brightest star in the night sky after Sirius in a very short period of time. It dominated the sky for a short period of time, then faded to invisibility. This event was noted and incorporated into the old traditions of the Burong people in western Victoria. In scientific terms, what happens is stars shed about 20 solar masses of debris out into space. They call it a supernova imposter event. They call it an imposter because it didn't blow the star apart, but it was sort of like a supernova. It became extremely bright, shed those outer layers, and as those outer layers went into space, they cooled and it blocked some of that light from the star. But the important thing is, we know this is the case because a man named William Stanbridge sat down with the Aboriginal people back in the 1840s, recording their old traditions, and they pointed out this star, and they explained to him what it meant. He looked at his star catalogs and didn't really understand what it was. There was no star in his catalogs of that brightness in that part of the sky. So he wrote all the information down. And that information he wrote down is how we can definitively tell what star he was talking about. But it does show us that Aboriginal people observed nature very closely, and whenever a rare event happened, it was incorporated into the old traditions. So the old traditions contain a moral charter, they contain information, but they do evolve. They can change over time to incorporate new information. And of course, the right there is just sort of a generic image of a supernova. It's when a star explodes. And there are some stories that describe the appearance of new stars in the sky that only last for a short amount of time. The last thing I want to talk about on this section here is, like you said, twinkling stars. We all know stars twinkle. It's one of the things, it's written in poetry and lullabies. Everybody knows it. But did you know that the twinkling of stars can tell you a lot of things about changing seasons and weather? It's not just aesthetic. It has a practical application. In the Torres Strait, I was sitting with elders on Murray Island, or Mer, which is where Eddie Mabo was from. Did anybody see the Google Doodle a couple of days ago? Right, that was Eddie Mabo. So he's the one who spearheaded the fight to overturn terra nullius and have native title established, which he did successfully. Unfortunately, he died just a couple of months before the decision came through, but I met his daughter, Gail Mabo, a couple of days ago, and we had a fantastic chat. When I was sitting with some of these elders on Mare Island, I asked them about the twinkling stars. And they had explained to me that knowing how to read the stars can be very useful for fishing, for traveling at night, for hunting, for planting your gardens, because it tells you about changing seasons and about weather. Are the stars twinkling fast, or are they twinkling slow? Do they appear very blue, or can you see multiple colors? Are the stars very fuzzy, or are the stars sharp? What causes twinkling stars is wind movement, turbulence in the atmosphere. It can, when you're in the Torres Strait, you've got seasons dominated by trade winds. It can tell you when the winds are changing. If the stars appear very blue, you don't see many red stars in the twinkling, that means storms are coming and there's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. Why? Well, because water in the atmosphere absorbs the red and green wavelengths of light. They don't absorb the blue wavelengths of light. That light comes through. So when you look at the sky, it's twinkling very rapidly. That means high winds. If you don't see many red stars, the stars appear very blue. That means there's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. Coincidentally, I was at a conference in Hawaii last year, speaking with a PhD student working at the University of Alaska. He works with the Northern Dene people of Arctic Canada and Alaska, and he told me they have very similar uses for the twinkling stars. So we're actually publishing a paper that's going to come out very soon on that. But what I wanted to do now is play a short video of a song. So the elders said, look, we have a song about this. It was written back in the 1960s by George Passy. It's in the Merriam-Mir language, so I'll translate it when it's done. But this is describing the twinkling stars and the significance they have. I have to pardon my mess up there. I've got to go back through and fix the video. The song starts to repeat after that. It's a fantastic song, and I had no idea what it meant. So he sat down and he wrote out all the lyrics in the Merriam language, and then we sat and translated them. Uncle Allo's a bit of a linguist himself, and he's helping to standardize the Merriam language. And when we translated it, we explained what the song meant. Basically, the lyrics say, why are the stars shining so brightly? Why do they look like embers in a fire? Or why do the stars twinkling so fast? Why do they look like embers in a fire? I think it's because of the changing seasons. The clouds from the northwest are being brought to the southeast. Why are the stars twinkling so bright tonight? Something along those lines. And what he's describing is knowing how to look at the stars, see them twinkling very brightly, and knowing that the trade winds are changing from the northwest to the southeast, which goes from the summer months to the cooler winter months in the Torres Strait. And he goes on to explain in the interviews how islanders could look at the twinkling stars and know whether they should go out fishing just by reading the colors and twinkling of the stars. Would it be safe to go? When they should start planting their crops on the islands? So there's a lot of information encoded in that just about the twinkling stars themselves. I'd like to talk a little bit now about the dynamics of the sun and the moon. In most Aboriginal cultures, like I said, the moon is female, the sun is female and the moon is male. And there are a lot of traditions that talk about the dynamic between the two. Most of the traditions have stories about the relationship between the sun and the moon that tie in with the phases of the moon. And of course, we know that Aboriginal people and Islander people on the coast worked out the tides related to the moon phases long ago. But in many of the traditions, it talks about how the moon man, so one example is a story from the top end in Yolngu. It's one of the many different stories. But there was a moon man who was sort of lazy. He just sat around all the time and made his wife and his daughters do all the work for him. So they would go out and collect food, and he would just laze around. So what happens if you just sit around and don't do anything you eat? You get bigger and bigger and bigger, which describes the waxing phase of the moon. Well, eventually, when he was at full moon, he got very frustrated. The wives and the daughters got very frustrated and angry, and they took their axes and they began hacking bits of him off in retaliation. He began waning away until he died. He died for 3 days before he came back to life again. You find this motif, this idea, this concept of the moon getting bigger and bigger and then fading away and dying for 3 days before coming back to life all across Australia. And you find the idea of death for 3 days and coming back to life all over the world. And most of those traditions tend to be tied with the period of the new moon, when the sliver of the moon that's lit up by the sun essentially disappears for about 3 days before it comes back out again on the other side of the sun. But it describes the traditions, or the traditions describe the phase of the moon quite accurately, quite interestingly enough. What happens every few hundred years from many places on the earth is something called syzygy in scientific terms, which is an awesome Scrabble word if you can ever use it. Syzygy is when 3 astronomical bodies are in perfect alignment. You get the sun, the moon, and the earth in a perfect alignment. What do you get? You get eclipses, right? So this is a solar eclipse, or you can get a lunar eclipse. So the solar eclipse is when the moon is between the earth and the sun, and a lunar eclipse is when the earth is between the sun and the moon. Lunar eclipses are not terribly rare. They happen, a few times every few years, but solar eclipses are incredibly rare. Any random place on the earth in the southern hemisphere, you'll see a total solar eclipse every few hundred years. That's it. So given that they're extremely rare events, and the longest a solar eclipse will ever last is about 7 minutes of totality, where it completely blots out the sun, very short amount of time. You wouldn't maybe expect very many of these to be recorded in oral tradition, but you find many, many examples where it is recorded. There are a lot of stories that talk about the dynamic between the sun and the moon, and if the sun woman and the moon man are in a total solar eclipse, what do you think they might be doing? Embracing each other, right? Embracing each other. And that's exactly how many of the traditions talk about the sun and the moon, that during a total solar eclipse, they're an embrace, or something close to that. Some of the traditions talk about ancestors from a world on the other side of the sky dome becoming very curious as to what's happening on this side, and they all start peeking across behind the sun. And as they're peeking across like this, their hands and their bodies cover up the sun for a short amount of time. So there are different traditions about that, but you find quite a few of them talk about the dynamic between the sun and the moon and their act of love during a total solar eclipse. It also shows that these very rare events can be incorporated into oral tradition. It also tells you, this happens during, of course, the new moon phase when the moon essentially disappears. So Aboriginal people are very well aware of the position of the moon and the sun relative to each other, even when one of those objects is essentially invisible. Something quite interesting that I wanted to share with you guys related to the Eddie Mabo doodle we saw just a couple of days ago is also from Uncle Allo Topham. So what Mabo's fight did for terra nullius and overturning terra nullius and native title meant that indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people could claim native title for land. But on Murray Island, they were still having a problem with their sea rights. They didn't have the recognition for sea rights. So only about 11 years ago, the elders in the island were battling the government. I can't remember if it was the Queensland government or the Australian government. Excuse me for that. That's your homework to go find out. The lawyers for the government were saying that each of the islands in the Torres Strait was a separate little enclave, and that the Torres Strait Islanders across the straits didn't have really any connection with each other. The others are going, what are you talking about? Of course we do. Our marriage classes, kinship relates to all of this. So what Uncle Allo did was actually performed a traditional song in court to the judge called Gedge Togia. This was a moon dance. A very traditional moon dance that was spoken in two different languages. The Meriam Mir language, which you see in the east on Murray Island, and the Kalalagoya language of the Mabiag dialect on Mabiag Island out in the west. And those two islands are almost due east-west of each other. Gedge Togia means moon rising over home. It means rising over home, and Milpanuka in the Kalalagoya language refers to the moon. So if you're on Mabiag Island going home, back across the straits to Murray Island, to Mirror, you're going to see the moon rising in the east over your homeland. So he said he got all mic'd up in court, performed the song for the judge, had the dance, had to explain what all the men were wearing, all the traditional garb, the dari, the headdress, the feathers, everything. Explained all of that information to the judge, and that's one of the crucial pieces of evidence that helped them win their battle for sea rights, which they did get. Uncle Allo said he was the youngest person to witness for all the elders, and he was only 60 years old at the time. So one of the things that we did when I was up there last year is we actually filmed the Gedge Togia dance, and he's giving me permission to show that publicly very soon. So that'll be quite interesting. It's a beautiful dance. Now going on, looking at astronomy and material culture, this, like I said before, we have lots of knowledge about the stars tied in with the properties of stars, their position in the sky, the sun and the moon, how they're used for calendars and navigation. That knowledge is encoded in material culture and passed on through tradition. So what do I mean by material culture? Well, things you can touch, not oral. So at the top left is a famous dance machine from the Torres Strait. This one is about, well, they refer to it as a comet dance machine. It's called a comet dance machine, but it's actually describing a very bright meteor, which in the east of the Torres Strait they call a Mayer. It's a very bright fireball. And the dance machines are used during the dances. They're a mechanical device that show motion, and they're used to enhance the performance. So you've got the lyrics of the song, you've got the movements of the dance itself, plus the motion of the dance machines that all reinforce this knowledge over and over. So this dance machine here, the comet or the meteor dance machine, you can see it's got the two handles, and basically it shoots out like this. It shows the meteor or the Mayer shooting across the sky. The dance machines are very common in the western islands, not so much in the eastern islands. So when I say Mayer, I'm just sort of using a term for a bright meteor, but it's not actually the same term they use in the western islands. But the islanders, when they talk in the east about the Mayer, each one of the properties of the meteor means something. When a bright fireball goes across the sky, it means somebody important has passed away. The brighter the fireball, the more important the person. The little bits falling off of it, the sparks as they call it, are the weir. If you got many sparks, that means that person left behind a large family. The trajectory of the meteor told you where that person's home was. So all these different properties of these celestial phenomena have significance and importance. To the right there is an example of some rock art from the Sydney region. This is Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, and it's a photograph of an emu engraving, and just above the emu is a figure of Daramulin. You can't see it very well, of course, in the photograph. In southeastern Queensland down through New South Wales, the main creator figure in Aboriginal traditions is Biami. Down this part of the country, his name is Bunjil. But Biami had a son called Daramulin, and Daramulin had an emu wife. So the interesting thing about this engraving is it shows the emu's legs behind it like this, as if it were flying. And of course we know that the emus cannot fly. And it turns out this is probably an engraving of the emu in the sky. It actually reflects the position of the sky and aligns to it at that time of the year. So you can see how astronomical symbolism is incorporated into these traditions. Or I'm sorry, into the rock art. This here is a bark painting from the top end of the Milky Way. So when you look at that, it's a very beautiful painting, but it's not meant to, really be aesthetically appealing. I mean, it is, but it's got tons of information. There are storylines all throughout that painting. So each one of those motifs in there has meaning, it has importance. And one of the really frustrating things that I find is when you go down to one of the tourist shops where you see lots of Aboriginal art, you may have a big, beautiful painting, and all it tells you is the artist and where they're from and maybe the dimensions of it. It really never tells you the meaning. And all these artworks have meaning. This is something that is quite interesting. This is a very large stone arrangement not far from here, near the Little River, between here and Geelong, called Wurruyuwan. This is in the traditional lands of the Wathaurong people. And it's a stone arrangement of about 100 basalt stones that range in size from yay big to about my hip height. And they're arranged in this large sort of ovate shape. And from this end to that end is about 50 meters, and it's on a very slight gradual slope. And on this side of the stone arrangement are some other stones facing out towards the west. Very little is known about the stone arrangement. There's this old joke in archaeology, when in doubt, say it's ceremonial. Well, it probably is ceremonial, but we really don't know much about it beyond that. But we do know some physical things about the site. And we do know that these straight lines of the stone arrangement, if you're standing down there at the apex and you look along these straight lines, those point dead on to the position of the sun at the winter and the summer solstice. And these small stones on the other side do the same thing. And if you're standing there looking straight down, there's 3 large stones there that show the sun at the equinoxes. There are old ethno-historical records written down by early colonists that said the Aboriginal people were well aware of the positions of the sun throughout the year, particularly at the solstices, and they had special significance. So again, paying close attention to the world around you. I'd like to finish up by talking about something that has always been of particular interest to me, and this is where the sky meets the land. And in particular, what I'm referring to here are cosmic impacts. This is Auntie Mavis Mabunka. She is a custodian of the Western Aranda people in Alice Springs, or just west of Alice Springs, about 120 kilometers. She tells the story of Norla. Norla, in the dreaming story, long ago there were 8 women who took the form of stars and were dancing a corroboree in the Milky Way. One of the women was carrying a baby. So in order to dance, she placed the baby in the turner or the kuleman, the wooden basket, and set the baby at the edge of the Milky Way. And she went off to do the corroboree with the women. Well, as they were dancing, they shook the Milky Way, the baby fell out of the sky, came down to the earth, hit the ground, the turner fell on top, and it drove the rocks upward. Which we can see now is this giant circular mountain range, this ring-shaped mountain range that Western scientists call Gossa's Bluff. The baby's parents, the morning and the evening star, continue to search for their lost child today. And if you look in the sky, you can actually see the Terna falling from the Milky Way as the arch of stars that Western astronomers call Corona Australis, or the Southern Crown. The arch of stars looks like a Terna falling out of the Milky Way, which is just above it. Now, what's quite interesting about the story is it talks about a star falling out of the sky, hitting the ground, driving the rocks upward. That's how meteorite craters are formed. Okay, and it's a meteorite, not a star proper, but it's minor detail. This is a giant asteroid impact crater that formed about 142 million years ago. At that time, the ground level was about 2 kilometers higher than it is now, but as he wrote it down, the central uplift, I'm not going to go into all the geology behind it, but that's essentially how this ring-shaped mountain range formed. So the scientific explanation of the origins of this crater and the indigenous, the aboriginal traditions are the same, just couched in a slightly different language. And actually, when I sat with Warren Williams, who's a famous country music singer in Australia, he's also relative of Auntie Mavis, and he's one of the traditional custodians of this site. And he was telling me in an interview that when you see meteors, that's other members of the family who are still looking for their child today. Now, that's an example of a really old meteorite crater, 142 million years old. Is there anything more recent? Are there more recent meteorite impacts that would have occurred when humans were in Australia? And are there any traditions about that? And the answer is yes. The Henbury meteorite craters are about 125 kilometers south of Alice Springs. They formed about 4,500 years ago, give or take a little bit. They formed when a nickel-iron asteroid, a small one, came into the Earth's atmosphere, broke apart because of the pressure, and created about a dozen different meteorite craters spread out over about a square kilometer. Some of the bigger ones, like you see here, about 180 meters wide. Some of the smaller ones are only about 10 meters wide. And traditions about this crater are that this is where people were breaking sacred law. And a fire devil came down from the sun, ran down to the ground, set the ground on fire, created those big holes, and killed everybody in the area for breaking sacred law. So it described an event that happened 4,500 years ago that was recorded in the 1930s. And this wasn't just one elder, this was several different elders over the course of a couple years telling the same story over and over. In fact, when early geologists went to go visit the site, the Aboriginal elders said, "We don't go there, that's a forbidden place, that's a sorry place, we do not go there." One of the craters, this one here, there's actually 3 craters you can see right here. The one here with all the trees in it, a creek empties into it. And they say that, even though that crater can fill up with water, they do not collect rainwater because they're afraid that if they do, the fire devil will fill it with a piece of iron again. So quite a remarkable story from a very long time ago. So it shows a connection between natural events and how they're incorporated into oral tradition. And a very common explanation for these is how these natural destructive events are caused from breaking sacred law. We saw it earlier with Julpan and the boys being taken up into the sky for breaking sacred law. So I could go on and on and on, but I think I'll stop there, and we've got time, I think, for a few questions. Excellent, thanks. Dead on the minute, too.
Earlier in the talk, you were talking about how they saw Orion as the canoe with the 3 brothers in it, and then later you were referring to it as the man chasing the Pleiades. I was just wondering, was that like different cultures, or what? Why did they see it as 2 different things?
So that story about the 3 brothers in the canoe was from northern Arnhem Land, and the story about Orion chasing the 7 sisters, that was down northern part of South Australia, in the Great Victoria Desert. So you get very different traditions all across the country. There are a lot of traditions from New South Wales that suggest, we don't know for certain, or at least I would say we researchers don't know for certain, seem to suggest that Orion is seen as Biami. At least in some areas that's the case. And it might seem odd because Orion's upside down, but it's still the same figure. because some of the traditions talk about how when Miami was going down in the sky, he tripped and fell hands first. So it seems to show the same position of the arms and legs as the Western version of Orion, even in Australia. Any more questions?
But it's not astronomical. But are there any stories about the volcanoes?
Are there any stories about volcanoes? That's a very good question. Yes, there are. Western Victoria, as I think most of you in the room know, is geologically very young. You had volcanic activity just a few thousand years ago. And there are traditions that talk about mountains burning, Mount Gambier erupting, and about how there was a relationship between the burning of the mountains and a coming in of a giant tsunami, a wave that came in and killed everybody. So that's actually some research we're about to start doing right now, actually. But if you go up to Queensland, south of Cairns, there are 4 crater lakes, and they were formed when magma came up and heated up the water table. So it superheated that water, and that water exploded out of the ground and created those craters, which are beautiful clear water lakes now. There are Aboriginal traditions that talk about, again, breaking of sacred law, how the ground exploded and people fell into the holes and it killed people. But one of the interesting things about the oral tradition that was recorded back in the 1960s is that one of the elders said, well, this wasn't rainforest back then when this event happened. It wasn't rainforest like it is now. It used to be scrub, eucalypt scrub. The next year, scientists did a core sample from the bottom of the crater, and using pollen found out that the rainforest is only 7,000 years old. When this event happened over 10,000 years ago, it was eucalypt scrub. So that shows the possibility that this oral tradition has been passed down from 10 to 12,000 years. And of course, we have lots of traditions that talk about the changing sea levels at the end of the last ice age. And people think, well, the changing sea levels would have happened very gradually. Well, no, actually, the ocean came in at the rate of 100 meters per year in some places. And there are traditions from all around Kolat that rapid climate change and the rising of the sea levels. Right. All right, so the question was whether or not we're having any conversations or action about light pollution. So with the urbanization and quite frankly out with even some of the mining, it's destroying the skies. We can't see anything. There are problems now in Sydney and Melbourne. We can't even see the 5th star of the Southern Cross. It's gotten that bad. So the question is, are there conversations with communities? Yes, there are. In Sydney, there's, I feel bad, I forget the name of the society, but there's a society dedicated to educating the public on how to reduce light pollution, to save our heritage. Because you think about it in the terms of mutual cultural heritage to both Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. You know, for better or for worse, when you look at the early colonization of Australia, a lot of that was based on astronomy. Cook came to Australia after observing the transit of Venus and Tahiti. Famous sites we know of in the country, Brisbane, named after Sir Thomas Brisbane, who was an astronomer. You know, William Dawes, the first person to record the Aboriginal language in Sydney, was a government astronomer. There's a lot of astronomical heritage tied with Australia, but we can't see half the stuff in our skies. And as the skies become polluted, we lose that connection to culture, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. On that note, quickly, you were saying that most of the population can't even see the Milky Way. Back in the early 90s, there was a blackout in Los Angeles. The 911, your 000, was inundated by phone calls about this crazy-looking clouds in the sky. People were freaking out. It was the first time they'd ever seen the Milky Way. They had never seen it, had no idea what it was.
that tells you something about how we lose our connection to the sky. And, I was a kid growing up in rural Missouri. I spent a lot of time outside where I could see the stars. And that was one of the things that inspired me to be an astronomer. I don't know if you're going to have many kids living in the cities who are going to be inspired by astronomy. I mean, maybe if you see, the images online or something on your phone, but if you go outside, you can't see very much. So we're losing a lot of that culture from both the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal perspective. Yeah. Okay.
In your discussions with viewers and others, have you collected any stories regarding the Southern Lights?
I've collected lots of stories, but okay, yes and no. Not directly from Aboriginal people about the Southern Lights, but there are lots of records about the Aurora Australis from an Indigenous perspective. And most of them, of course, come from mostly Tasmania, down here in Victoria, even Perth, South Australia. Because we're sort of the northern extent of the auroral zone sort of comes into the southern bit of Australia. But you actually find discussions of Aurora, oral traditions about Aurora from southern Queensland and Uluru. So you can actually have Aurora get that far north. I think it was last year we had some Aurora that were visible from Sydney and even Brisbane, if you're right outside the city limits, or outside the city lights, sorry. So yes, there are lots of stories about the Aurora Australis. In fact, if you want to go online and just look up Aboriginal Aurora, I actually wrote a paper on it a couple years ago, so you can find some information on that in there. But yeah, mostly stuff from Tasmania and Victoria, really.
I was just wondering about Uluru and that's reflected in their stories in the sky, and also the form of Uluru and what we know about the history of it.
So the question was the connections between Uluru and the sky. I don't know. I'm sure there are. That's a very sensitive topic in the Central Desert, and especially as a non-Aboriginal person, I'm a little bit hesitant to say, oh yeah or no. I don't know, actually. I really don't know. I know that they have a lot of traditions. I know some of the traditions, particularly about the Seven Sisters, are considered women's business, and they're very sacred and many times very secret, so it's not information I'd be privy to, even if I wanted to be. So I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are, but I don't know them. Okay. Meriam Mir. That's a Papuan language spoken on the eastern islands of the Torres Strait.
With rock art painting, are there examples of astrological events that have been found and recorded in rock art?
Yes, so at the very beginning, I'll rush back real quick. I showed an image of Bill Edom Damaharney, right there. Uncle Edom Dama, he's a caretaker of vast amounts of rock art all across that region of Wardaman country. And he talks about, he's got paintings of the Milky Way, which he refers to as the big boss, one of the main figures. So there's lots of astronomically themed rock paintings and rock art up in that part of the country. There's a great book called Dark Sparklers, which is all about his astronomy, all about Wardaman astronomy. It was written back in 2003 by Bill Harney and Hugh Cairns. It's a great book if you can get a hold of it. It's called Dark Sparklers. It's a fantastic read. It's chock-a-block full of information. And even one of the stories I mentioned about twinkling stars, he talks about the star Canopus. It denotes the season of the glow beetles, but also when it's flashing really brightly in the sky, that means the monsoons are coming. So even though it's only one little clip in that book, he's talking about the twinkling stars and how they were used to show the coming monsoon seasons as well. So I think, how are we running on time? A couple minutes, okay, yeah. Oh, sorry, there's one in the back there, sorry, real quick.
Do the Indigenous people understand that the Earth orbits the Sun? Do they think the Sun moves above the Earth?
Tricky question for me to say what other people believe, but I mean, when described by a lot of Indigenous people, you had some who described this sort of the sun coming up and then going to the underground and coming back again, and some where there was an example where I think it was Charles Mountford, I could be incorrect on that, was asking an elder, and I think the elder just picked up a box and just said, it's like this. So it seems to describe, the Earth, the Earth going around the sun. And a lot of the Aboriginal cultures in southeastern Australia, the sky is believed to be held up by large branches. And there are certain people, important people, who are responsible for holding up the sky. And I believe there was a book written called what is off the top of my head? Doesn't matter. It talked about the sky falling in 1788 when the first fleet came. And it was seen as, it was perceived as one of the elders who was down here in Victoria had broken down one of the corners of one of the branches holding up the sky, because in some of the Aboriginal traditions, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, that their ancestors were supposed to come back, but they were going to be light-skinned. So when the colonists first came, they thought it was their ancestors, but then they didn't behave anything like the ancestors were supposed to. And there was a lot of information, behind that. I think it's called When the Sky Fell or something along those lines. I think the guy's name is Wiley. I forget exactly the details, but you can look it up. But lots of different views of the sky by Aboriginal people that are, current or in the past. And I think one of the important things to mention before we finish up is that there's a long-standing colonial mentality that Aboriginal people are dying out, the culture's dying out, and that most of it's already been lost. Most of the traditions are already gone, and that's not true. A lot of the remote Aboriginal communities have a phrase called "Here come the anthros," or "Here come the archaeos." And it's this never-ending parade of anthropologists and archaeologists who would come in from universities, from the government sector, who would sit down, demand all this information about culture and language and tradition and, sites. And they would disappear, go back, write their books, make their fortunes, build their careers, and form public policy and decisions that the Aboriginal communities were never consulted about. And a lot of times, the information was used against the Aboriginal communities. So it left this sort of really bitter taste in the mouths of Aboriginal people when it comes to archaeologists and anthropologists, which is completely understandable, which is why now we have very strict ethical guidelines, like the work I'm doing in the Torres Strait. We have to be invited there by the community. We have to have a mutual benefit. The elders themselves can even be authors on the books and the papers. Some of the papers I'm writing now, a couple of the elders are going to be authors on them. They maintain the intellectual property. I send them back all the papers before they're published to make sure they're happy with it. It's a collaborative process. And then, of course, we develop all kinds of educational materials and things like that with community. And it's done in constant collaboration and consultancy with the community. I don't just take it and say thanks and then run off and do my own thing. It doesn't work that way anymore. But what I'm getting to with all of that is there's this idea that, these cultures were long ago destroyed and that we don't really know much about it. The language is mostly gone, the traditions are mostly gone, and that's rubbish. They're not. A lot of places did suffer heavily, was damaged heavily, especially in places where the major cities are that had heavy colonialism or heavy colonization. But there are places where the people are bringing back the language. It's happening in Tasmania, it's happening to the Wiradjuri people, it's happening all over the country. The language is experiencing a renaissance and a resurgence. A lot of the traditions, Aboriginal people know their old traditions, their old stories. They may choose not to tell anybody because whenever they did that, bad things happened. And there's also a whole list of, there are multiple, upwards of 30-odd levels of knowledge above what the public know about. So most of the stories you guys hear about are the preschool versions of the stories. And, if you go through initiation, you can learn the upper levels, which obviously doesn't happen in most cases. So people still have this knowledge. It's still being passed on. Ceremony still occurs. The language still occurs. It's still thriving. Part of what we're doing is helping to reconstruct some of that in areas where it was damaged, and also help, develop educational materials with the places where, it's still strong and thriving, like it is in the Torres Strait, for example. Yes, a lot of it's passed on through dance. So song, dance, the motions of the dance itself would mimic, the movement of the animal or whatever it happens to be, and that would tie in with the stars as well. Right. What happens in the sky also happens on Earth, yes. One of the common sayings for that. So up in the Torres Strait, for example, there are lots of star dances. There's moon dance, there's Eclipse is a dance about eclipses. There is a comet dance, there's a Tagai dance, there's various different star dances. They all have different meaning, but they all relate to the sky. And it's not just the sky, it's how things in the sky relate to the land and things as well. Yep.
Or another question to my mind, do the girls and the boys get the equal amount of knowledge, or is most of the knowledge or different parts of that knowledge?
So the question was whether or not the knowledge about astronomy is shared equally between the boys and the girls when they grow up, or if that varies on community. I know some communities, most of that's restricted to men, others it's restricted to women, or maybe certain elements are restricted to one or the other. That varies quite a bit. I know the Torres Strait, I don't know actually, that's a very good question. I think it's one of the things I'm going to have to ask when I go up there again soon. Okay, last couple. Okay.
Now, I know one of the first slides you had one from Stellarium, and I think I've heard that, and it's quite a long story. There's a story about a man eating emu in there, and to me that obviously refers to that gymnornis or something. Wasn't there one of the megafauna that died out? There was emu. So obviously, to me that says that thing remembering that megafauna when they came in, and I'm like going, well, I don't blame them wanting to get rid of a emu. Is there any other megafauna that are remembered? Because I don't recall hearing any other stories of megafauna being remembered from back, because all the megafauna died out soon after that they arrived.
So the question was about megafauna in these traditions, because this is taken from the Burong people, which are clan of the Wargaya language group in northwestern New South Wales. And one of the constellations here is the emu, but it is actually referring, apparently, to the old megafauna, giant man-eating emus. So the question is, are there other traditions around Australia that talk about the megafauna? Yes, there are traditions that talk about the megafauna. I don't know if or how they relate to the stars, except in this case. Unfortunately, there aren't many of us doing work in this area. It's a very small group of us. We're trying to expand, and we're getting more Aboriginal students involved in this as well, because why should a white American be talking about this? I mean, really, you know. So we're getting Indigenous students to come in and get involved and eventually take over this sort of research down the road. Yeah, megafauna, went extinct 40,000 years ago or so. So you talk about deep time oral tradition, well, that's a pretty good example of that. But I don't know beyond this story if those are connected to the stars. I'm sure they probably would be. I'm sure if you had gigantic man-eating or human-eating animals roaming around, you're gonna remember them, even if they're gone. Okay, last one. Yep.
You mentioned Mars. Are there stories about the other planets, the other more obvious planets in the sky?
Yes, there are lots of stories about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Oddly enough, we haven't done a sort of comprehensive study of planets. It's one of the things I'm wanting to do very soon, hopefully. And what I'll finish on now is I mentioned before the bird, the red-tailed black cockatoo. Where is he? There he is. Beautiful photograph. Oh, I forgot to put the caption of who took the photograph. So somebody look it up online and give me a chewing because I forgot to put the caption in over who took the photograph. But the story talks about the red-tailed black cockatoo and its relationship to Mars and Antares. And what I find interesting is different cultures, the relationships between stories that are very similar. So, in the old Greek tradition, Mars and Antares are related to each other. Antares means the anti-Ares, or the rival of Ares. Who was Ares in Greek mythology? The god of war. Who was Mars? The Roman god of war, right? Why? They're both very bright, they're both very red, and because the ecliptic, the path of the sun, passes through Orion, that means all the planets, the moon and the sun are going to come close to that line in the sky. Sometimes Mars and Antares are very close to each other in the sky. They're both bright, they're both red, they're both fighting for dominance. They're rivals in the sky. You find a lot of Aboriginal traditions that talk about that same dynamic between those two objects as well. So it's quite interesting. Time, I think we're good now.
Yep. Dwayne, to thank you for that fascinating and enlightening presentation. We've got a very small gift, just as a token of our appreciation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And could everybody join me?